Greetings, comrades. Today we are going to try to decide if the atomic bomb use on Japan was more about ending the war quickly um, and avoiding an invasion of the Japanese homeland islands, or was it more about intimidating the Soviet Union and getting them to play ball the way that we want them to play ball when the war is over? It's no surprise that everybody kind of understands that the Soviets are going to be the new enemy of the United States, even before World War II is over. So we're trying to kind of figure out how much that might have played into the decision. And that's kind of the historical debate. Was this necessary to end the war against Japan? Was it necessary to show the Soviets what's up, right? Either way, you're talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of Japanese civilians being vaporized. And certainly the morality of that comes into the equation. But let's take a look at what we can look at, right? You are now in section 3 of the lesson that I created on the war against Japan. We did lessons 1 and 2 before spring break. And I would like to remind you of how the Japanese fought, okay? We are now on part 3, the atomic bomb. Some reminders. Japanese deployment of banzai charges and kamikaze attacks, okay? We know that they will fight to the last man. There were extremely few prisoners that were taken from any of the islands that the United States had to clear out. We know that starting in 1944, they have been using kamikaze pilots, many of them barely over teenage years, flying planes, suicide planes into our stuff. So we know that the Japanese are willing to commit suicide as an honorable way out, okay? Fighting to the last man. Iwo Jima and Okinawa were both battles that were fought in the winter and spring of 1945. So it's right there on our minds, okay? We also know that Japan had ordered training for civilians to resist an invasion of the main islands with spears, if necessary, bamboo spears, men, women, and children training in the streets, okay? If the United States were to invade the Japanese islands, civilians absolutely would have been called upon to defend the homeland with their lives, if need be. That all being said, many of the reports coming out of Asia from military commanders across the theater were saying that the Japanese military had been reduced to a shell of itself. By summer of 1945, when the actual bombing takes place, the Japanese have no navy to speak of. It has been almost completely destroyed by the United States. The aircraft has also been largely destroyed due to combat and suicide missions. So the actual Japanese military capacity to fight a war had been significantly diminished. Add to the fact that we had firebombed Tokyo so that Tokyo is leveled, as well as some other cities in Japan. There really isn't much there that they have left to even build stuff that they need for a war, okay? Meanwhile, the Soviets are extremely aggressive in Eastern Europe. And you're going to see they will attack only after the first atomic bomb is dropped on Japan, okay? So that should also kind of factor into our equation. Remember, I want to call your attention now back to the Yalta Conference in February of 1945. While we are meeting at Yalta, okay, the Battle of Iwo Jima is raging in the Pacific. There's not necessarily a timeline for how long this war is going to end. And the Soviets promised that within 3 months of the surrender of Germany, they will aid us in our war against Japan. Well, Germany surrenders in May, clock's ticking. June, July, August, right? The third month since the surrender of the Germans, we are going to deploy the atomic bomb. That happens in August, but first there's the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945. At the Conference of Potsdam, there is kind of a discussion. Well, first of all, who's there and who's not? That's really what we need to look at. All right. The big three looks different now. Okay. I mean, Joseph Stalin, because he's like a cockroach that won't go away. All right. Franklin Roosevelt has died. Okay. He had grown ill and passed away. Big funeral, big mourning, blah, blah, blah. But now the guy that has to take us the rest of the way home is Harry Truman, President of the United States. Winston Churchill has been voted out of Parliament. Okay. Now that the war has come to a close, or is coming to a close in England, England is going to shift from conservative to liberal in order to rebuild. Okay. And their new guy, I believe it's spelled like this, Clement Attlee. So these three are now meeting at Potsdam to figure out the end of this war. A couple of things are there. Unconditional surrender, right? We got to get the Japanese to surrender unconditionally. There's also discussion about the dividing up of Berlin into occupation zones now that the Germans have been defeated, and who's going to occupy what, right? There's discussions of the United Nations that the Soviets have promised to join, and the war against Japan. Meanwhile, during that conference is when Harry Truman gets the message that we've got this new weapon that's been successfully tested in the deserts of Alamogordo, New Mexico, right? It had been in production since 1940 under something called the Manhattan Project. It had been top secret, but being that the Soviets are better spies than we are, they already knew what we were up to. They were able to infiltrate us through Canada and basically spy on all of our stuff. I mean, the Soviets actually had spies in our programs to develop this thing, okay? So when Harry Truman is told in July of 45, we got this new weapon, and he makes some allusion to it at the Potsdam Conference, Joseph Stalin, tip of the cap kind of thing, like, good luck with that, comrade. The reality is he already knows we got this thing, okay? Nobody really knows what he's going to do. After dropping leaflets on the Japanese on August 5th, I believe it was, in the days before the dropping of the bomb, in their language, we warned the Japanese they need to surrender immediately or they are going to face destruction like they've never seen before. Now, the Japanese are used to American destruction. I mean, we've leveled many of their cities. We have thoroughly whipped and defeated them, on their islands, in their empire. So they don't really appreciate what we mean by total and utter destruction. But this is a warning that we drop, and we do not get a reply. And therefore, President Truman orders the deployment of the atomic bomb as a necessity. The argument is really that the bomb is being deployed for a couple of reasons. Let me list those here. Okay. End the war quickly. Avoid an invasion of Japanese homeland, which could cost up to 1 million casualties are the estimates. Okay. Compel an enemy who won't surrender to finally do so. Okay. Sorry, I should probably separate these, which I normally do for you. Okay. And then really revenge for Pearl Harbor and the Bataan Death March that the Japanese forced our guys on when they took the Philippine Islands, indiscriminately killing prisoners of war. It is a very infamous moment where the Japanese tortured and killed Americans as well as Filipinos back in 1941, right? And to be honest with you, scientists Want to know what it's going to do. Like, hey, we spent millions and millions of dollars on this thing. How effective is it going to be, right? And all these factor in. But what about the Soviets? Okay, that's what we also want to consider. Like, is this also being used to show the Soviets what's up? Like to just show them this is our boomstick, right? That's the question. So the bomb is deployed. Um, Hiroshima is chosen because it's a target that hasn't seen any real damage yet from the war, and it'll be easy to measure how much damage it actually does. I don't know how much you guys know about the atomic bomb, but it basically explodes over the target, right? Creating this like fireball that I believe measured about 500 meters high. And the heat at ground zero was thousands of degrees Celsius. So it is very, very hot, obviously, turns the ground to glass, boils the river that runs right through ground zero there. So that when people who aren't vaporized try and jump into the river to avoid the heat, they're jumping into boiling water like you'd have on your stove that you would boil eggs in, okay? So this intense heat, intense flash destroys everything in about a widening 3-mile ring. People that are far enough from the explosion that are not vaporized literally describe their clothing being blown off of their bodies and their underwear being singed to their skin, okay? That is what we're talking about. People's silhouettes and death poses are burned into any walls that remain standing. I mean, it's all the way bad. You know, there was a Japanese school for like middle-aged girls around ground zero that gets vaporized, okay? There's some discussion that there may have been U.S. prisoners of war in Hiroshima when we dropped this thing. So, I mean, there's a lot of, it's very dirty, right, in the deployment of it. But everybody can see immediately what it can do. And that was done on August 6th. The Soviets attack on August 8th, 2 days later, and they overrun positions in Manchuria and in North Korea. Think about that, Manchuria and North Korea. We asked them, as the U.S., to stop at the 38th parallel because we don't have any troops in Korea, right? Which they do. They didn't have to, but they do, okay? So the Soviets start gobbling up territory, let's be honest, while the war is still on, and they're justified in doing so, okay? After the Soviets attack on August 8th, the United States drops a second bomb on Nagasaki on August 9th, okay? So I want you to look at the timing of that, okay? To what extent is that second bomb being dropped for all these reasons up here? And to what extent is it being dropped for this bottom one down here, okay? That's what I want you to think about. I mean, there's an argument to be made there. This kind of shows you the devastation of the blast, okay? This is a short video clip of Harry Truman giving his address to the nation as to why we felt we needed to do this. The Japanese will petition for surrender after the second dropping of the atomic bomb on August 9th, right? It will be just a couple days later they formally surrender on the USS Missouri. That is parked right off the shore there. The Japanese are going to be allowed to keep their emperor. So much for unconditional surrender. We just want this thing to end, okay? And it needs to end while the Soviets are still gobbling up territory out there. So take in all this information together to try and decide how you want to answer this prompt here. Analyze the extent to which the use of the atomic bomb was meant as a calculated measure to intimidate the Soviets, as opposed to a military necessity to end the war in 1945. So that's what you're going to do as your journal entry. Make sure you get that done, and then tune in for the module tomorrow, Tuesday, April 6th. Thanks, guys.